Welcome to the Mind Vine podcast, where we challenge the stigma associated with mental illness through conversations about a variety of issues impacting mental health. Here we bring you news, views, and interviews that intrigue, educate, and celebrate recovery. Leading us on this journey are the hosts of the Mind Vine podcast, Darryl Mathers and Chris Bovie.
So welcome to the Mind Vine podcast. My name is Darryl Mathers, and I'm with my co-host, Chris Bovie. Hi, Chris. How are you?
Hey, Darryl. Good to see you virtually.
Yes. So as this is our third or fourth COVID-19 podcast, the ones we've been doing from our remotely. And before we kind of get into today's special guest, which I think Chris and I are both pretty excited about, we want to give a shout out to our staff at Ontario Shores who are providing mental health care throughout the pandemic, and healthcare workers everywhere. This is a very challenging time for everybody. And while, we kind of settle into this new normal, we want everybody to know how appreciative we are of everything they're doing and to keep our patients safe in our community. So thank you to everybody out there. So on to our guest today, which I'm personally very excited about. I'm wearing one of his old teams on my chest. Kelly Hrudey, who I was saying to Chris earlier, and this is not to make you feel old, Kelly, but I don't remember the NHL without Kelly Hrudey. You were, you were a player when I started, watching hockey as a young person. You were in the NHL, and then you transitioned right from the NHL to broadcaster. You've been a part of my NHL experience my whole life, so it's an honor to have you here. So officially welcome Kelly Hrudey, ex-NHL goaltender and current broadcaster on Sportsnet and Hockey Night in Canada.
Cool. Well, thanks for inviting me on your show, Darryl and Chris. I'm looking forward to it, and I think you guys and most people that sort of follow me away from the hockey environment know that my family were heavily involved in mental health issues, and we've talked openly about our daughter, Caitlin, and I've come out recently talking about some of the things that I've gone through. I didn't know it at the time, but I think now at my age, I fully recognize what I was going through in LA, and so very open about talking about these issues.
Well, there's no shortage of issues today with what the world is going through. How are you and your family doing through all of this?
I think that we would be very similar to everybody else around the world, and not just Canadians, but all of us that are going through this and the stress of the pandemic. And not only are we going to be healthy physically, but mentally, I think the strain was really getting to a lot of my family members. My wife, I know, ended up stressing herself out so much, ended up getting shingles. All three of our daughters have had issues in terms of, how is it going to look on the other side? Financially, it's different for everybody and so on. So what I've said to most people is that going through this, listen to your thoughts because they're real, and don't try and just push them down and not share them. Whether you have to share it with a family member or friend, and or if you're a friend or a family member, look out for others and try and notice the signs, because you can notice the stress on somebody. And I think that it's very important and I should have done that Sunday when I knew my wife was really getting worked up about the pandemic. And I should have been more intuitive and asked her, hey, honey, you okay? It seems like you're really preoccupied with the pandemic. Like that Sunday in particular, she was flipping channels like crazy, all about the news of the pandemic. And I think all of us that day were starting to recognize the severity of this, and it just beat her up. And then the next morning, I think she said she woke up at 5:15 in the morning with great chest pain and so on, and thought that she was having a heart attack. So we ended up taking her to the hospital, and, she checked out just fine. Her heart was okay, but ended up, like I said, getting shingles. But for other people too, there's, I think all of us should be very empathetic and sympathetic towards people that are going through this, because it is very stressful for everyone.
Yeah, and I think we can't really escape it right now, right? It's social media, it's on TV. It's just, even my kids are watching it all the time and having questions about the pandemic. But I saw it was interesting, and I thought it was really great that you do on a bit of a podcast, you do your video testimonials, and you
Yeah.
said, I actually skipped a week because I wasn't feeling it, and empowering people to say it's okay to not be okay,
Right.
and to take a bit of a break, because we're so used to always saying to people, how do you feel? Great. When we don't feel great, it's okay to share when we're struggling.
Absolutely. And that is, I took a week off, and I just couldn't do it. I wasn't up to it. And I wore that T-shirt that you mentioned, it's okay not to be okay. And I had a lot of great reaction from that one. And I think that's the important thing, that we sort of look after ourselves too. I've always said this, or not always. Most recently, I've really come to the conclusion, I don't know, about 3, 4, 5 years ago, be kind to ourselves. Like I'm terrible at beating myself up. Like I'm really good at it. And there's no reason for that. If I think I have a bad broadcast, whether it's on Hockey Night broadcast or Sportsnet Flames broadcast, and if I'm not what I think the level I should be, man, I'm good at beating myself up. Like if I'm here in Calgary and I'm driving home after the game, I'm worried about, why was I that bad? Were you not prepared? Or, ridiculous, right? So I think coming through this, I'm going to try and be better at that for myself, and, just put a bad performance behind me and live with it and accept it.
Right. I want to talk a little bit about, you had mentioned earlier about your daughter, Caitlin. And so from a parent's perspective, we know now she was dealing with OCD and anxiety disorder.
Yep.
Early on when she was younger, what were some of the signs, and what, as a parent, what were you going through when you started seeing these behaviors that you didn't quite understand, and how did you process that?
Well, the first one, Chris, and I don't know if you can see it on my camera, but I'm going to get close to my camera, and this is what she's doing all day long, blinking her eyes. And what we were to find out later is that she thought that she was going blind. Well, first of all, I should explain for the viewers that Caitlin, with her anxiety and OCD, she has 2 thoughts that she wakes up with every day, and it's concerning dying and diseases. So her brain was going around. She taught us this years later about the loop that just goes round and round and round. And she had no tools to break the loop until years later, when we were able to, after years of help, finally get her, these are her words, not ours. She's, after 4 years, started to have more good days than bad. So, but going back to those times when she was about 11 years old, she had what I called at the time quirky little habits. Now, so it was the blinking, and then these other things that started to present themselves. It was harder for her to go to school. She didn't like to go to dance. She was blowing off sleepovers, didn't like to be around her friends as often, loss of appetite. In fact, at one point, Dawn and I counted up, this is years later, counted up how many signs she had, and I think we counted something like 13. Now, back in 2013, when she went public with her story, we partnered with RBC, and they had a campaign called Know the Signs. I think they had identified 5. So you can tell if Caitlin had 13 and not just 5, she was in a really bad place. So when she was 12 years old, that's when her life became completely unmanageable. So it was completely debilitating. She couldn't go to school, couldn't go to dance, couldn't do anything, couldn't leave the house. Basically wanted to be around her mom all day long. And so that first day of school in 2005, that's when Donna was driving her. I wasn't in the car that day, but they came home immediately, and Donna said something, if only you could have seen the sheer fear in her eyes. So that day, we were able to find a psychologist. Luckily, they were able to get her in the next day. So when Donna called originally, and I know a lot of Canadians have this problem, when Donna called, they said, yeah, I think we have an opening in 3 or 4 months. And so that's not right. So they were able to get her in the next day because there was a cancellation. It's not like we jumped the queue or anything. And so that was the start of that process. And we were so lucky that she had a connection with her doctor, a guy by the name of Dr. Kelly Hrudey here in Calgary, and he changed her life. But it was a long road. It still can be a long road. Like those things surface every once in a while, and sometimes they're somewhat more manageable, and other times they're debilitating again. So we recognize that.
During that process, Kelly, I mean, it must be, mean, I don't know if it's even harder as an athlete because you're so used to, I have a challenge. I know I want to problem solve it, fix it right away. And for you as a parent, the things she was saying in your mind would say, well, you're not going blind, but it's so real to them. How hard was it for you to sort of process what she was feeling and sort of how you would approach a problem and fix something?
Yeah, well, I think that it was different for me to see what Caitlin was going through. So I think my wife and I, Donna, we're very understanding, and I don't know if this is the right word, accepting of what she was going through. So it wasn't, we weren't trying to fill her head with get over it or tough love or, none of that. It was all from a very understanding place. So we did recognize when we, like I said, that first day of school in 2005, we recognized at that point that there was something really serious going on, and that this wasn't one of those things where at times we all do have to just power through things, but that she was not in a place to do that, Chris.
Right. Yep.
I think I saw an article or a comment that when you're doing some of your advocacy work, just how, you maybe before you thought you had an idea of what mental health was or mental illness or, maybe not specifically anxiety or OCD, mm-hmm. But then when you saw your daughter struggle with it, you realized that you really didn't have much of an idea of what those illnesses meant. So I'm wondering, what type of education process has it been, for you and your family to learn more about what your daughter was going through?
Oh, wow. What a journey. Well, we've been on and learning personally about the effects of mental health. It was eye-opening for me. I mean, I had little to no knowledge of what people were going through. And now looking back for sure at some of my teammates, there were guys going through things, definitely. And I had no idea. I had no idea to ask them a question if they're okay. I didn't know what they were going through. I wouldn't have known the magnitude of their troubles. So it's been, in a sense, I hope people take this the right way. It's kind of been a cool journey as well to learn about it. And I'm very grateful that I've had the chance to learn about, humans and what we're all going through. Because, by the way, I say this often when I go public speaking about this, the Canadian Mental Health Association will tell you that 1 in 5 suffer. Well, and I suppose that's correct if you say that where it's maybe debilitating, where they can't leave their house or they're, that greatly affect. But I think it's like 4 in 5 or 5 in 5, because I think we all have something. Maybe it's perfectly manageable to a degree, but I know that just looking around and talking to people, people come up to us every single day, whether it's in the coffee shop, well, I guess that's not now, but in a regular world, and or I get text messages, or how Chris reached out to me a couple of weeks ago, and just talking about it, and it's really heartwarming.
And Kelly, looking back and sort of at your career and you did your book, going through your journey with your daughter, was that kind of an awakening? Did you sort of look and see symptoms and start to look at your own life and career? Was that kind of how you kind of learned, I was going through something back then? Was it an education process just for you to go back in your own life?
That did happen, but it wasn't immediate, Chris. So what happened was when Caitlin started to get to a better place, and then we were really learning as a family. And that's the other thing. We shared everything with her 2 sisters. So so they knew what was going on, and that the things that Kate was learning and so on. And so once we got to a better place, and we do use humor in our family when it's appropriate about mental health and so on, and I'll tell you a story in a minute, but then the kids started to tease me about my OCD. I've never been clinically diagnosed, but clearly I have it. And so some of my things, which I thought were just habits, for instance, if I go to a hotel room, and I'm in hotel rooms a lot, and if I'm going to stay there more than one night, I have to get the little washcloth and set it up by the sink, and then I put my toiletries all on the washcloth, all in a particular order. And now it doesn't drive me crazy if I can't do it or if the order's messed up a little bit, but it is pretty important to me that I have that washcloth and then the toiletries set out there. So we kind of joked about that, but when I talked about the humor, after Caitlin was getting really good and really doing well, we might be somewhere and I'd say something like, okay, so what do you have today? And she'd say, well, today I have a brain tumor. She has a different kind of cancer. I have this, or I have, so it became kind of like a running joke. But she had the tools, of course, to stop that loop and rationalize her thoughts. And so that's what, it's so cool to see how somebody can be in that position at one point and then after a while, then they're in a good place mentally.
All goalies seem to have superstitions, so maybe that's a little OCD. Did you have anything that you did before games, or any little?
I did early on, and then I think it was in my second year, guys, that we were having a game in Washington, and I used to put my sticks all in a particular order away from everybody else's. My sticks that were ready for the game, and I'd usually have 3 or 4 for every game. And the young stick boy came into the dressing room. He might have been 14 or 15. And he grabbed my sticks and then put them over by where everybody else's sticks were on the stick rack. And I guess I must have snapped at him because Denny Potvin was sitting close to me. He goes, Kelly, something like, knock it off. You've got to get over that, because it doesn't matter where your sticks are in the dressing room. It doesn't matter if they're against that wall and you put them there, or if the young lad put them over there. You have to make sure that you don't think that that's going to or affect the outcome of the game. And it was a great lesson. So I basically let all my superstitions go. But going back to the last comment about when I did learn about what I was going through and so on, that's when I finally identified that, in particular, in my book, I talk about an episode I was having in Milwaukee. We had a neutral site game there, and the thoughts had been with me for months about could I still play at this level, and can I keep it up? And I'd been in the league, I guess, about 10 years, and I knew the league average was about 3.5 years, and just those thoughts were consuming, and I just couldn't break that loop in my head, and then that's when it really started to go south for me.
I wonder about your daughter now, just to circle back. How's your daughter doing now? And can you explain kind of the pride that you've had in watching her through this journey?
Well, first of all, she's under some stress right now because she was supposed to get married this fall. And we have on top of the wedding, and first of all, we've made a decision she's going to get married, or she's made the decision she still wants to get married. She doesn't want to postpone it. She's got a lovely fiance, Hayden, and they've made the choice that even if we can't all gather as expected or hoped, they're going to have a wedding here, most likely in our backyard. In fact, she's in our house right now with my wife going over some plans, so hoping that can ease the stress level for her. But in terms of the pride, of course, and I've told her many, many times, I think she might be the strongest person I've ever met. And just to go from where she was when the summer of 2005 and before that, to where she is today. And she's had some setbacks, definitely, like most people with mental health issues. You can have some setbacks, but there's no shame in that and shouldn't be embarrassed with that. That's just part of the nature of mental health. And so she's been able to overcome those setbacks, and just so proud of her. And I think one of the things that makes it so much better or more influential is that because she shared her story, it's cool how so many people know about her journey and what she's gone through and the strength, and letting other people know it's okay.
Yeah,
Kelly, how was that? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, Kelly, because I know Chris and I, working in the mental health field and trying, part of our role is to try and reduce the stigma associated with mental health, so people reach out for help. I know when we heard your story, we're like, Kelly Hrudey's a mental health advocate. It's all, you celebrate when people come forward, that have some sort of notoriety or influence. And because you want so badly, for mental health to get the place in society that it deserves, right? To be on the same par as all sorts of other critical illnesses. When you and your family made the decision to come forward, I mean, you have experience dealing with notoriety, but did the wave of appreciation or enthusiasm, did that surprise you guys at all?
Yes and no. I only hesitate because I was very concerned. So Caitlin came out publicly in, I want to say, April of 2013 in a really big way. There's an article in the National Post, and in fact, I think it was the front cover. Joe O'Connor of the National Post did a beautiful article on her. And then the Canadian Press, I'm trying to think of her name, Delrose. Man, I'm so embarrassed I can't remember her name. She also wrote a beautiful article and captured Caitlin's spirit a little bit differently. But the night before we were going to go public with it, I had a great conversation with Caitlin. I was in St. Louis for a playoff game, and she is here in Calgary. And I called her and said, let's just have a chat here. Make sure we want to do this, because what I was afraid of, social media was gaining speed at that point. And I was afraid of the haters or the people that might bash her on social media. So we had a great conversation about that. And much to my surprise, she didn't have one person bash her or said hate or anything. And so that was amazing. That was cool. And so that's why we speak often about that. If you are troubled, if you're hurting, if you need help, don't be ashamed. Nobody's gonna shame you or embarrass you. It's a sign of strength in today's world, and I think that's really, really great. And and in fact, here's another message that we have about this. You do not have to share if you don't want to, though. That's not the prerequisite that if you're going through something that all of a sudden you have to share your story. Some people can't. We have another person that we love dearly, and they're going through things and they're getting quite a bit better, but they're not comfortable sharing, and that's fine. There's no mandate that you have to go out and share what you're going through, because it's also personal.
True. Speaking of young people, one of the things you did some work with Bob Wilkie, and I did a tour of across Canada, speaking to young hockey players, athletes. Anything surprise you when you did that, when you're speaking to young people about anxiety and mental health issues?
Okay, I love that you know about Bob Wilkie. In fact, I was just texting before I came on with you guys. We're chatting about another project he has coming up in June. But for the people watching this that don't know about Bob Wilkie, you should Google him. So he, like myself, is a second rounder back in the day. And he had his childhood was different than mine, though. I had a really wonderful upbringing, and I didn't go through trauma. Bob went through a lot of trauma as a youngster, and he shares the stories and so on. And then on top of that trauma that he had a really terrible situation when he was playing in Swift Currents as a junior hockey player. And tragically, he was on the bus in which 4 players lost their lives in that accident, very much like the Humboldt bus crash. And so he had to deal with that, of which he did not get any help. And so he carried that burden with him for a long, long time. And it led to some addiction issues and so on. Anyways, why that's important is because he's doing so well now. And he's such a mental health advocate, doing incredibly well. He has that I Got Mine program. But I knew Bob, but I didn't know him well. And he wrote a book. And so my wife and I went to the book reading, I think it was in 2012, started to learn more about Bob. And then he invited me to be a part of his I Got Mine program. But before I accepted that, I wanted to go see him working with the kids' teams and how he interacted with the kids in the dressing room. And it was really, really cool. It was very informative. It was transformative as well, because people weren't talking to others like this. And so here's my point. At the very end, this was so cool, working with like 14, 15-year-old kids. And after the session was done and they're about to say their goodbyes and something, he'd say something like this. So Chris, you're first. What would you like to say to Garnet or whatever? And Chris would stand up, go, hey, Garnet, I love you. And then right? Young hockey players telling each other that they love each other is so cool. So at that point, I was on board.
Great. Were you surprised going around? Were kids sharing their own personal stories as well?
Starting to, yeah. And that's why now I'm more involved. Although I have to admit, when Bob asked me 3 summers ago, to get on board with these tours and so on, I accepted heartily. But what I quickly recognized is that I'm just too busy to really do it as often as I had hoped. And so we do some of this, the podcasts and webinars and so on, because just with my busy travel, I was trying to do things with him, not only in Calgary, but in other communities. And I tried, and it just became too much for me. But I'm still a part of the program, and I do it in different ways. But oh my gosh, it's so cool to hear young kids now coming on in these sessions, or when we go out to schools or things, and they share their story fully, and there's no shame, and it's really cool. It's emotional for everybody, but that's okay.
It is fascinating, the shift in hockey culture, which is part of what you're talking about, right? Like,
yeah,
I've been in locker rooms, most of my life, and it's amazing. Just at the low level that I've played, just the words that are no longer acceptable in the locker room setting, in a team environment, the coaches use, like, the whole language has shifted, and the understanding that people in leadership positions have for various issues, mental health being one. Has it happened? Like, how would you describe, I guess, that transition, maybe from a mental health standpoint, and how that culture is shifting? Is it quickly enough? Is it faster than you thought? Where do you think it's at?
I think it's both. I think it's shifting, and maybe at times I think it's quicker than I expected, and other times there's still some things that just really puzzle me. And now some people are still left behind, and they don't understand the new world and how you have to treat people and what you say and what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it seems like every week or two we're shocked and surprised by what some people say, and that's hard to understand. But then here's another heartwarming one. So I'm driving around today, running some errands, and doing it properly. So everybody knows social distancing and all that kind of stuff. So we're very safe. In fact, it's very difficult for my wife and I, because we love our 3 daughters, and we're grandparents, and we can't see our young grandson very often, if at all, right now. And we're trying to be really cool about it, make sure we're doing the right thing. But anyways, so I'm driving around, and I'm listening to Hockey Central at noon with Jeff Merrick, Justin Bourne, and Brian Burke, and they have Paul Bissonnette on. And most hockey fans know who Paul is, and he has that Splitting Chicklets podcast with Ryan Whitney, and they're going to sign off. And Paul says to the 3 hosts, he goes, "Okay, love you guys." Like, how great is that, right? We're actually in the hockey world saying "I love you" at the end of an interview, so it's really cool.
To Brian Burke,
right?
We had him on the podcast.
Yeah, a little while ago.
Did you?
He's intimidating. Well, I don't know. He's a very interesting guy.
I'll share a little story about Brian, and Paul Bissonnette said something very similar today, but it was a number of years ago when Brian was still managing in Vancouver, and at that point he was even more gruff than he comes across today. And but I was starting to learn. I was going out to Vancouver quite a bit to do Canucks games on Saturdays, and I was starting to learn quite a bit about Brian that most people didn't know or understand. And so one time there was a tragic story. There was a young player that he was about my age, so not a young player, but by the name of Gary Lupel. And Gary was a talented player. I played against him in junior when he played for Victoria. Man, I just loved that guy's passion for the game and so on. Anyways, he after his playing career was done, he ran into some problems and he had some addiction issues and so on, mental health, and Brian and the Canucks alumni went to great lengths to help Gary out and get him back on track and get him sober and so on. And once he started to do well, Then they gave him a job with the Canucks, and he was a video scout, I believe, and they had the Canucks scouting staff really helping him and making sure he is on track and making progress. And then he could start to go on the road, and he was doing really, really well. And unfortunately, one day when he was 40 years old, he was visiting his dad in Powell River, BC in the summer, sitting in his favorite chair, and he has a heart attack and dies. And so Brian, I told that story on air one night, and how Brian was a big part of getting Gary healthy again. And I said, so you people out there, and I think I've been pointed at the camera, I said, you people out there that think Brian is just this big, tough, burly, gruff guy, there's a side of him, and he doesn't want people to know it, but he's really soft inside. And I didn't hear anything from Brian, and then I flew home Sunday, didn't hear anything from him. Then on Monday, I get a call. And I go, hey, Brian, how you doing? He goes, don't you ever do that again. Don't you ever tell people I've got a warm heart, because I've worked hard at crafting this image that I'm a big gruff guy, and I don't want to ruin that. So we had a good chuckle over that. And then we became pretty good friends. We went fishing a few times up in Haida Gwaii in northern British Columbia. And so I've definitely seen a different side of him.
There were in hockey, when there were a number of players that had tragic suicides. And at the time, I wonder if it changed. So I was kind of unhappy at the time when media were talking about it, because everybody wanted to go to concussions. And I felt like anytime a player had a mental health issue, it couldn't be just because they're a human being. It had to be related to some kind of head trauma, which in some cases there could be a connection. But it almost did a disservice to hockey players that, well, they can't have depression or anxiety like the rest of the public. Do you think that is starting to change for athletes?
I totally agree with you, Chris, and I hope so, because you were right. There for a stretch there when people were tragically losing their lives, they were focused on one issue and not looking at the entire picture. And I'm not going to get into specifics, but some of the people that we're talking about had mental health issues, and that wasn't talked about it enough as it should have been, for sure.
Speaking of the bigger picture, you can't call it Kelly Hrudey without talking hockey specifically about your career, and we'll get to today a little bit. But this was kind of going through, getting ready for today, and like I said, your career has pretty much spanned my time watching hockey, and I think back to when you broke in into the league. You broke in with the Islanders. You're coming off 4 Stanley Cups, and I always remember that time as even though you guys went to the final your first year, 5th time in a row going to the final, that it was kind of like the Islanders' swan song. That obviously the Oilers were coming up, and you guys were kind of like old and beaten down, if you will.
Yeah. And
then I started going through the roster again. I'm like Mike Bossy was 26 when you lost that cup to the Oilers. Yeah. I think Dennis Potvin was 29. Trotch, all you guys were in your 20s, and you had you coming up, and you had Pat LaFontaine was an 18-year-old kid on that team. And I start going through the years. It's like you guys should have won more.
Well, it's a tough league, and but I think that for those guys that have won the 4 Stanley Cups, as you mentioned, I made that team the following year. There was a lot of wear and tear in the bodies, and you know what? What really struck me not long ago is that when I went through that roster again, and I wanted to see how young those guys were when they retired. Like Mike Bossy, although he had back issues, he retired, I believe, at 29 or 30 or something. Dennis Potvin retired at 32 or something. Brian Trotch, he played a little bit longer. A lot of those guys were retiring late 20s or early 30s. Like in today's game, lots of players are playing well into their 30s. Like I even played until I was 37 years old. And if I would have been 32, I'm not thinking about retiring. And so it was a different mindset back then. But those guys had a lot of wear and tear on their bodies. There's no question about it. The Oilers were a great team. We were in transition, as you mentioned. Pat LaFontaine joined us after the Olympics, as did Flatley that year. We called up Gord Dineen and so on. But man alive, was I ever intimidated going into that dressing room my first time, especially. I was drafted in 1980 after their first cup victory over Philadelphia. And back then, most often, unless you were a first rounder, you weren't invited to training camp. But for some reason, I was invited to camp on Long Island, and I didn't have any expectations, right? I knew I was going back to junior, but much to my surprise, the very first preseason game was in Chicago, and I was going to play. I had no expectation of playing a preseason game back in 1980, but a couple of stories really stand out to me. And so it was commercial flights, of course, back then. And I'm on a plane in a middle seat, and Brian Trottier is right here, and Mike Bossie's right here, because they were best of friends. And I don't think it's a secret that management put me in between those two guys just to watch and learn. And I did that. And then we get to Chicago, I played 2 periods, let in 5 goals, I think, on 36 shots. At the other end was Tony Esposito, so I couldn't believe it. Also, I'm playing against Tony Esposito. And then after the game, the guys, virtually the whole team, took me out for beer and pizza at a deep dish pizza joint in downtown Chicago. They didn't let me pay for a thing. And I've never forgotten how nice those guys were to me, a young 19-year-old rookie, and it was just so cool.
I remember the NHL before you played, if that makes you feel any better. So I'm a little to go. But it's funny, I was thinking about you on the broadcast, and I've always watched you and loved what you bring to the broadcast. And you always come across as sort of a very thoughtful, gentle sort of nature to a broadcast as well. But then I remember you in your career, and I don't remember that side of it. I remember a more intense player. Was there a real difference between? Am I right? Comparing
you're right. You're so right. I played with, and I don't mind sharing this. I played with full hatred in my heart. I hated the opposition, and I was feisty as can be. Like, I think some people thought that when I went to the Islanders, I sort of inherited that trait from Billy Smith. No. I had that going way back in my childhood. Like I was a fierce competitor, at times too fierce. I found out later how I was a couple of despicable things I did in junior that I'm not proud of. But no, I played, I think, the right way for the most part, because I came to play. I didn't like the other guys, and I wasn't cutting deals on the ice. And hey, I've known you since we grew up, and if you score on me, I don't mind as much as other guys. None of that in my mind. I could, and even my friends I had, or if I played junior hockey with you, I could hate you pretty easily on the ice, and 10 minutes later when I see you in the hall, we're all good.
I play the same way. Unfortunately, it doesn't sit well in beer league men's hockey. I can relate. The most memorable moment for me with you in an Islander uniform is Easter epic.
Oh yeah,
Washington. And Pat LaFontaine scoring the winner. My God! And it's like, you think about back then. Imagine you had like one trainer. Imagine you're not drinking Gatorade between periods.
Right.
Like, what was that? Like, I think that was 4 overtime periods, right? It was like 2:00 in the morning before the game was ended. Like, how did you get through that?
Okay, well, I'll go back a few days. So we ended up falling behind 3-1 in that series. And so we were able to fight back and tie the series up on Long Island. But we're going to Washington for Game 7. And we're without Dennis Potvin, Brian Trottier, Dennis Potvin, Mike Bossy, and Brent Sutter, 3 of our best players, not in the lineup because they're injured. And Brian Trottier is playing with a separated left shoulder. So the odds were in Washington's favor, but I'll tell you what, we had a lot of fight in our game. And that was just a phenomenal experience to go through. But you're so right, Darryl, that, what we had in terms of nutrition going into the game, how we hydrated before the game, it's nowhere near how scientific it is now. I don't recall ever having like power bars in the intermissions or anything. And we didn't have pizza, nothing coming to sort of get some energy. I recall after the game, like you said, it finished at 4 minutes to 2 in the morning. It started at 7:30. After the celebration, the handshakes, and I recall doing some interviews after, and then I get into the dressing room and I start taking my gear off. And I finally get my pads off, start to undo my skate laces, take my skates off, and I was so dehydrated that immediately my toes curled under. That's how I was dehydrated. So what did I do right then to hydrate? I had 2 cold beers.
That sounds delicious, actually.
I don't think, well, they don't even have beer and dressings anymore, but back then that was a thing. And so I had the cold beers, and I can tell you what, they went right to my head.
Oh, I can only imagine. After the, like, you're kind of, for your first 2 teams in the NHL, kind of really interesting environments to go into, right? You're with the Islanders, this legendary team, 4 cups, Mike Bossy, one of the shortest, greatest careers ever. And things are starting to change on the island.
Yeah.
You get traded to LA right at the end of Gretzky's first year in LA when the whole league changed. What was that experience like? Actually, I'll back it up. What was it like going to LA and, for a road trip in 1987, 88? And then what was it like going into LA as a visiting player and as a king, in the post-Gretzky era?
So when I made the Islanders, I thought that that would be like the most celebrated team around, having guys like all the guys that we just talked about. And I thought I knew to a certain degree celebrity, and I did. But when I finally met and played on the 87 Canada Cup team and met Wayne Gretzky, that changed my perspective on everything. I had no idea how popular he was. I knew he was the best player in the game. I knew of all the records. I played against him for years. But to be around him personally and see the media attention that he was getting and the attention from the fans and so on, that was eye-opening. I had no idea the life that he was living. And then when I was traded to LA in February of '89, thanks to Wayne, in fact, because we formed some sort of relationship, and he thought that I might help the Kings. Then it's a different transformation, sort of, because, okay, so I did know his popularity, but now when you're traveling on a team with Wayne and you're going to all these other places to play, this was kind of cool to learn and to understand the human brain and psychology, because here's the world's most popular player, the best player, all eyes are on him. So if we're going to say a place where maybe not normally, they normally probably wouldn't sell out, it's a sellout because it's Wayne Gretzky, right? So it put added pressure on all of us. And that was a good thing because we couldn't let our buddy down, right? So in a building that might have 12,000 people normally, now they have 19. And it's simply because of one person, and that's Wayne. And so how dare we go out there and, maybe not be as into it as we needed to be, or, you're talking to your wife and your kids are sick and you're a little preoccupied. You have to put all that aside. It was very important that we played well so that Wayne looked good. The other thing is that clearly stands out to me. When I was traded to LA, I believe in around Southern California, they only had 3 hockey rinks. There's the Great Western Forum where we played. San Diego had hockey history, and they had an arena. And there was a place called the Culver City Ice Rink about 15 minutes away from our home rink in Inglewood. Now, I've done some research about 4 or 5 years ago. There's something like 70 or 80 separate hockey facilities, some with multiple ice sheets. And so the game has grown so much, and I owe that to 2 people. Wayne Gretzky and Bruce McNall. Bruce had the foresight to recognize that the great game of hockey could be popular in Los Angeles and Southern California, or Northern California now, but it needed the right person, and that was Wayne, because all of a sudden hockey became popular. It was cool to watch the growth, and that's why I think a lot of us that played in the 80s and 90s in LA, we were so happy when the Kings won the Cup in 2012, because it was like all this hard work from so many people, and it's now paying off. And I'm proud to say also that California is now considered a hockey hotbed. Like a lot of the junior teams in especially Western Canada have kids playing from California. And when I went there in '89, if you told me that, I would have said, no, not a chance. It's not going to be a hockey hotbed. Maybe it's going to become a little popular in California, but that's so cool to talk about.
The amount of like first rounders and
right.
And I think one of the key indicators of how hockey's grown in the States is the amount of guys who play on third and fourth line roles who are from places like California, Texas. Mm-hmm. Like,
yes,
there are a lot of guys, like they're not just superstars, like they're developing, like grinders and six defensemen. Like there's some depth there.
You're right. And I'm glad you brought up Texas because that's so true. And I think the next wave might be from Tennessee because the success that Nashville's had, I was told that they play a lot of high school hockey there. And their system's a little bit different, but I was told when Nashville first started there, they had no high school hockey, none whatsoever. Now there's tons of teams and it's a real thriving program. So that's really cool as well.
Darryl just brought up Texas because I was a North Stars fan. He just wanted to rub that in a little bit. I'm just curious now, obviously we're all hoping hockey comes back sooner than later. How are you with Sportsnet and Hockey Night in Canada? Are you having regular meetings? You're on standby, or what's the life like for you getting ready for maybe a last?
Right. Well, it's a little bit different for me here in Calgary because I kind of separate a little bit and I do feel a little bit isolated, not in the same sort of contact that I normally would be. With my travels every single Saturday to Toronto and all my friends there and traveling with the Flames around the league, I had kind of become, I guess, accustomed to all the connections. And now when you kind of lose them, you feel, like I said, kind of isolated. Having said that, we have a weekly conference call with our Sportsnet people. Everybody's involved. It's really cool. On Thursdays or Fridays of every week, the Flames, Brad Treliving, has a conference call for all of us media here in around the Calgary area, which is awesome. And once in a while, the Hockey Night crew, we just have a sort of conference call, very similar to this, where we just chat and catch up with everybody and maybe have a beer while we're talking and stuff. So we're trying to stay connected, and I hope I'm not getting too optimistic. That is my nature, by the way. I am optimistic, but I'm starting to feel like there might be a little bit of momentum happening, and that's exciting to me that maybe at some point this summer we're going to see NHL hockey again.
Oh, God hope. Let's hope. I'm wondering if you or maybe your colleagues on the TV side, like, because your schedule is so free now, and there's only so much you can watch on Netflix and other things, in the internet. What are you doing? Like, have you picked up any new hobbies? Are you just chipping and putting in the backyard? Like, what are you guys doing?
My wife and I absolutely love golf, so we're starting to chat about when we might be able to get out there. And I'm hoping within the next week or two we can start to maybe play once a week or something. We like to play a lot, by the way, and although both of our games are crappy right now, we're hoping to turn that around this summer. We did a little bit of spring cleaning around the house, my wife more so than I, and I still have to. I did about half my office, and the project is kind of stalled now. I'm sort of waiting for orders from headquarters, translation Donna, that I have to get started again. I like to go for walks now that the weather's a little bit nicer here in Calgary. Two things that are really cool about this weird world we're living in right now. Because I'm so busy during a normal regular season that I don't call my mom as often as I should. Now, through this pandemic, I'm happy to say I call my mom every single day. So that's really great, and we chat. Maybe some days it's 5 minutes, sometimes it's 20 minutes, but I'm going to have to keep that up when we do go back to work because it's been great for both of us. Also, oftentimes if I'm traveling or if even during a regular season, I'm here in my office and I'm watching hockey and then, maybe have a little dinner and then I'll come back into my office for an hour or two. What has been great about this is that every single night, at around 6:30, Don and I start to prepare dinner. and we have a drink maybe together. She'll have a glass of wine, I'll have a beer. We'll have our dinner, and then we sit down together the entire night and watch TV. Whether it's, I have actually watched a little bit of hockey, and or Netflix and things like that. So it's been amazing. It's almost 2 months now, and every single night we're together watching something, and that's good. That's really good for us.
I think it's one of the things to keep in mind. I know, like, what you just said really resonates with me, because it's just frustrating. Like, this is not the life that we, chose to live, right? Like, but in the same breath, like, you need to make the most of it. And I know, like, I have 3 small kids, and I'm never going to be at home with them for 2 months again, 3 months or however long it be. I'm not going to be able to play basketball or go rollerblading with them at lunch, like in a year or 2 from now, right? Like those. So there are some things that are happening in this world that we're living in that I may never be able to experience again.
And people are doing things, that are really heartwarming. By the way, you can tell I love that word. I say it often because in these times we need to think that way. But so it was a few months ago. My mom was down visiting us, and she's, by the way, she's a real avid hockey fan. She still watches our broadcasts all the times, whether it's a Saturday night Toronto or when I'm doing a Flames game. And we were having a conversation about one of my coworkers, Cassie Campbell Pascal. And she was saying, I love the job that she does, and it's so rewarding to have her on the broadcast and stuff. And I said something like, would you like to meet her, Mom? She goes, oh my gosh, yes, it's on my bucket list. And I'm thinking, I think I can make this happen. So I happened to be on the road, and Cassie was going to be on the Saturday broadcast. So she and I went out to dinner on a Friday. And I said that to her, and she goes, we can make that happen, whether it's in Edmonton where my mom lives or here in Calgary if she comes down. And I thought, that's so terrific. And then the pandemic happens, and I'm thinking, oh boy, that's not going to happen for a while. So she calls me texts me about 2 weeks ago and says, does your mom have FaceTime? And I go, she certainly does. She goes, well, why don't I FaceTime your mom? So we set up a time, and it was just this past Monday, and she talked to my mom on FaceTime for 40 minutes. Like, amazing. And my mom was so excited. And she I think she sent me a text about a minute after they hung up. She goes, can you call me? She just wanted to talk about the conversation she had with Cass. And I thought that was so beautiful.
That's great.
Well, Kelly, this has been fantastic. I think for Chris and I think we could hold you here forever and talk hockey and mental health. And
I love it.
It's been really enjoyable. It's been an honor to meet you, and thank you for all the work you do in mental health. We need people like you. Like, I know what you said is true. Like, not everybody has to be an advocate. It's your own personal choice, and if you're comfortable with it, that's great. But I know as a movement, we need people like you, and we appreciate the work that you do. So thanks for taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, honestly, thanks, Chris and Darryl, for inviting me on your podcast. I love it, and I'll finish this conversation the same way Paul Bissonnette did today. Love you guys. Take care.